Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review the first 3 episodes of X-Men 97. So, really, I gotta state that beyond the X-Men Animated Series Season 1 review that I had gone on to do in the channel, and talked about how much I had seen other X-Men things in the past, really, I haven't watched anything X-Men animated related probably since then. And if you were to have gone on and seen that review, you would know like how much kind of fully that I know about X-Men stuff, as well as also knowing what's going on in even current X-Men comic books without actually probably even reading all of them. But so, because of course there's just this big huge X-Men event that's kind of going on in the comic books, and I really have no interest in it whatsoever, because every time I'm to go on and hear something about it, don't really care. But so we have me want to still watch this show because I knew enough about X-Men in general. And when I was to start watching this show, I didn't feel lost at all. Yeah, I didn't know exactly what was going on with Charles Xavier with this show, but really, I was to be completely fine with where these 3 episodes were heading, and I didn't feel like I needed to backpedal at all. And really, I really liked the Easter eggs that these 3 episodes had. And so for this, I have to go on and I have to state that like this is probably going to definitely get another season of it, because man, it is doing so much buzz-wise that I'm going through social media and I'm hearing certain people go on and say like, man, I just finally started watching X-Men 97 and here are my thoughts. Or I'm also hearing or seeing a lot of people kind of spoil this show regardless of if I wanted to know about it or not. So I really felt that there was so much buzz created that like I wanted to see for myself like what this show was about. And every single episode I started watching, like I realized that I'm like, man, like I just can't put this down. Like I got to keep watching. And hopefully it seems that people are also interested in what my thoughts were about this show, because I hope that I can justify just kind of continuing to watch more about it. So, with me having to talk about this show as cryptically as possible, like I'm not going to give away like the Easter egg stuff, but there's certain characters that I think were even in the trailer that I feel that I can go on and give away like code names of who they are, without it seeming like big, huge, massive spoilers. And also, I feel that really I can just kind of start teeing up these episodes for those of you who have also really gone on to actually see this show. And so, really, I think hands down the best thing about this was Morph. Because that was always the best thing about X-Men, the animated series anyways, was Morph anyways. But so, there are kind of other characters that are having good stories within these 3 episodes. Like, we obviously have to say, like, Jean and Scott right away. Scott Summers. But then also, we have to say, like, they're doing some real good with Magneto. And also, they're just kind of dropping the ball on Storm. They really are. Like, eventually, when they do give her a story, it's just like, man, that's what you're doing with Storm? Ugh. Uh, but then also, like, we have them giving real true, like, importance to Jubilee here, as well as also kind of doing something with Gambit and Rogue, I guess. That's something that they're doing is not exactly like the greatest, but then also with Rogue's altogether animated history of where her character eventually has gone into in other things beyond just X-Men the animated series, you can probably understand why Rogue is to fall where she is in these 3 episodes. Because eventually I've gone on to see certain other rogue-like things, and I'm like, oh, okay, like I can understand why like Rogue is kind of dancing between two characters, let's just say. And so I really love the fact that we have an X-Men team that every one of them are kind of busting one another's chops. Like, more than likely, anyone could go on and say it's like, well, that's what X-Men teams do all the time. But there's a lot of good comedy here. There's a lot of uh, just a lot of fun going on, and really, like, when I was to further and further watch other X-Men things at one point in time, like, they had a team, but it really wasn't a real true team show. At some point we would just focus so much on one character, aka Wolverine, that a lot of the rest of the show was just kind of lost. And I feel that we've come to this show and realized, like, no, like, this has to be a legit team show. Like, we're not gonna have one person carrying this show, and then also we're going to give people a lot of like the greatest hits of the past to kind of just be re-brought back here, but then also like here and there kind of bring up some newer things, and also those Easter eggs. So, with that said, with these 3 episodes, they were great. Thumbs up. So, really, when we're starting to have to tee up these 3 episodes, I feel that I'm going to say some code names of certain characters that I'm completely hoping is not a huge, massive spoiler. But if you know who DaCosta is, codename wise, then this probably won't feel like a massive spoiler. But then also, really for how these 3 episodes are kind of set up as far as villain wise, I was like, well, obviously the very first episode, like that's an obvious, like you have to go there. And once we get past these certain episodes, I'm like, okay, like I'm waiting for the pen to drop of like where they're going with the show. But then also, I really feel that if Storm wasn't handled well, probably Bishop wasn't really handled all that well either. But Bishop has never been handled well. Never. I feel like I never knew anything about Bishop rather than just his power set of borrowing off of other characters. But anyways, I don't feel like Bishop is a huge massive spoiler of like, oh my god, Bishop's on this show? No one probably really cares about Bishop, sadly enough, because he's just never been written well. But, anyways, yeah, like, DaCosta, of course, ends up being in this show Sunspot, and really he's just kind of there for Jubilee. And really, I also like the fact that they're not trying to modernize this show, that they are trying to uh, do certain things that are to be connected to the time period, like the cassette uh, Walkman thing, the tube TV, and really probably also other things that maybe people do not go on and do heavily nowadays. But we also had thing that I think is like a staple for every single superhero thing ever, and that, of course, is to be that merry-go-round. Man, how many times do we have to go on and have a merry-go-round that is to break in an episode? That is to be a staple for like everything. Like, watch the second Fantastic Four movie, and you'll see a merry-go-round that breaks. Uh, I feel like that isn't a huge spoiler about the show because it's just a certain like piece of equipment that they kind of use to just set up a certain character back into the show. But yeah, but um, other than that, yeah, like where they're also kind of going with Wolverine in this show, I'm kind of having a lot of fun with, because really we're having, of course, Wolverine consistently bust the chops of Cyclops, especially when he calls him dad. That was great. But also what kind of both Wolverine and Morph are kind of doing in this show, I'm just kind of back and forthing, um, like really what's going on there, because there's some questions to be had, and if we're really gonna probably go where we're gonna go with Morph and Wolverine, I think I'm fine with that. Uh, because really, like, Wolverine has kind of done it all, and so really, where they're going with Wolverine in the show, like, I would really want more. I really would, because of course Wolverine. But anyways, yeah, I can just be fine with it, because I'm assuming at some point we're gonna get more of Wolverine in the show. I would really like to hope so. But yeah, that's really as vague as I can probably be right out of the gate for this show. Because I also feel that there's going to be at a certain point where I'm going to have to go back to all this in the actual spoilers. But then also there's going to be the thought of me thinking that I probably did not say, or I did already say something, and I'm saying it again. So with that said, let's just go into spoilers to just be safe. And here's the thing. There's going to be certain characters in the spoilers where I'm going to have to possibly come up with names of certain characters, because I don't feel like they were clearly named in the show. Like, especially who the villains are in the early parts of the show, beyond the obviously named ones. I'll get there when I get there, when we actually get into spoilers. So let me pause this now. I'll get out my my notes. Like, my notes are kind of vague. They didn't go into very much specifics. So really, if you're going in and wanting like every piece of dialogue to be said by me of these 3 episodes, like, you probably would need to look somewhere else. But really, I'm going to go on and kind of do my best to kind of tell you what happens in these 3 episodes, and really have fun with it, I hope. As well as I hope that you had fun with hearing what I had to say about X-Men 97, because you're like, yeah, I'm excited about this show also. And I'm excited to see, like, that this is probably going to get a second season. I'm assuming it is. Like, it's doing so well. And then also, those Easter eggs, though, the more and more that I'm probably going to watch more of these episodes and see all of the stuff that they're going to be putting in to this that I've already kind of heard is going on, I'm like, oh my god. Ah, like, we're getting this character and these characters and that. And we're rolling in all these characters that have probably never been in the X-Men animated series. Maybe. So, or had been, but on other shows or other things or other whatevers. So yeah, that's a thumbs up for that. So, with that said, let me pause here and I'll get my notes out and we'll get into full on spoilers. Alright, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil these 3 episodes. So, firstly, Sunspot was pretty interesting to have on this show. And so, really, we have a lot of characters that are kind of wearing berets in this show that are to be these kind of mercenaries or militia or mercs or whatever. And so, at certain points, there is to have characters that are actually named, like Carl Denty, and he eventually becomes, in these 3 episodes, the Executioner. And so, like, that character, when of course I say Carl, you should know that character eventually becomes the Executioner. And so there's gonna be other characters like Mullet that's in the very first episode that's kind of has some bit of dialogue, then like they don't use him later on. So like really there's like certain like less than characters, but I'm gonna go on and kind of give you all the Easter egg characters as well, and also the third episode goes and does some really interesting things with Gene, which is really cool. But let's kind of roll this out as the episodes are to, of course, unfold. So, in the very beginning of this episode, episode 1, we come to find out through this news reporter that Charles Xavier had been killed by Gyrick or Garrick. And really, I did not go on and realize that Charles Xavier had died. And so I was like, well, okay. Like, I've seen other X-Men shows that had gone on and killed both, like, Xavier and another character. Like, I think in one X-Men series, like, they had killed off both Phoenix and Xavier on the pilot, and then like the Xavier team is just kind of moving on with like Angel, I think, leading the X-Men. But so furthermore, we go and have DaCosta, who is to be brought in by this Mullet character, who had been told that he is going to get a pretty good payday if he brings in mutants, so he had gone on to do so. And we come to find out that DaCosta is, of course, Sunspot, but he doesn't use his powers right away. If anything, he kind of waits till he's alone with Jubilee to show her a arm of his that is to just be like, okay, like, well, he's Sunspot, but like he's not doing really anything beyond him just kind of being DaCosta throughout this show, and he is to be this rich kid who owns a jet, but there's nothing really here story-wise that makes me care about this character. So DaCosta goes on and is talking to both Carl, the beret hat-wearing guy, and Mullet. And so DaCosta is like, well, hey, like, is this about money? Do you guys need to get paid for my freedom? And Carl is like, nah, Muty. Like, you think that you can just pay me and that's how things work around here? Well, no. And so DaCosta is just like, well, hey, man, like, it's not my fault that I was born this way, that I'm a mutant. And so Carl is just like, yeah, whatever, like, cry me a river. And, like, kind of Cyclops eventually tells Wolverine to cry him a river. So Carl goes on to eventually kind of feel his breath and realize, like, oh my god, it's getting really cold in here. Like, I think the X-Men are coming. And so we end up having first both Storm and Bishop coming in, and I'm like, all right, like, you're getting like 2 X-Men like right away that are to be characters that aren't going to be like Wolverine and aren't going to be like Rogue or whatever, that is to be kind of the just the characters you would normally see in the roster of characters. Not saying that Storm is to be like a lesser character, but I'm just kind of saying like it's nice to just kind of change it up that the first people that you're seeing is both Bishop and Storm. So, because normally you would just see Cyclops right away, and we eventually get to that, but still. So, we get Storm and Bishop, and we of course have Bishop who's kind of blasting off his guns, and Storm is kind of using her powers, and then of course we end up getting Cyclops rolling in, and DaCosta is looking at Cyclops, and he's like, "Well, you like a good guy or a bad guy?" And Cyclops is like, "Well, I'm Cyclops, so I'm a good guy." So the cool thing that we see about Cyclops is it seems like he's using his concussion blast to be able to kind of move around here, which I don't know if they've ever gone on and done that in prior X-Men things, but I thought that that was a really cool change of pace to see Cyclops kind of using his blast as a way to just kind of move around. So, plus also, we come to find that Cyclops, when uh, the X Jet ends up kind of gets destroyed by that Sentinel, like he uses his blast to kind of make his way to land onto ground, which I thought was a really cool idea in the later part of this episode. So Cyclops goes on to uh, fight these militia thugs, and then he ends up getting uh, kind of tied up. And so both Carl and the mullet guy end up like taking Cyclops' visor away from him. And Cyclops is like, "Oh no, I surrender." And we come to then have just Cyclops who just opens his eyes and blasts these characters. And so we have Cyclops who's kind of taking care of uh, all of these characters, and because both Bishop and Storm had both gotten knocked out. So we come to find that this militia is using these Sentinel blasters as weapons. So I'm like, okay, we're now weaponizing the Sentinel things. And I'm like, all right, that's like a very clever or smart thing to do here, because we always have to come up with kind of alien technology or something to just kind of turn around and kind of weaponize here for characters, and we're kind of doing that in this show with the Sentinels. So after we, of course, have Cyclops who had gotten away and had turned DaCosta into Beast, to have him kind of looked over to see like, okay, like, is he hurt? Like, did he get roughed up, or like, is this kid's powers like, are we going to be able to control it, and so on and so forth. But so Cyclops is to make his way back into the X Mansion and is to talk to Gambit, because Gambit is going on and just kind of cooking his food, and Cyclops is just kind of ticked, like, well, hey man, like, why didn't you go on and join our team last night? Because we could have really used like your power set. But then also, like, Bishop and Storm could have really been hurt because we were really kind of outnumbered. And Gambit is just like, well, hey, like you guys could have done fine. And plus also like Gambit, I think, really doesn't want to go on and get his hands dirty, it seems. Like, we really start to see in this first episode there's certain like X-Men characters that are really just kind of sidelined and they don't really do anything. Like Rogue in this first episode doesn't really do anything until she like absolutely has to, which is just kind of sad. But then also we get Rogue that walks in here, and Rogue is talking to Cyclops about like, well, hey man, like cool out. If anything, like you're so uptight that at some point you're gonna get a heart attack. And hey man, like since we had just lost Xavier, the last thing that we want to do is lose you too, because you're such a key character to our team. And then also we get Charles Xavier walking in, and he eats this toast and is to be talking to Cyclops and be like, well, hey, Scott, yes, I do realize that, like, you all are trying to live the dream of which that I was to have had and died for, and. But I really feel that you should consider what Rogue is saying. And this and that is, we have a walking Charles Xavier eating this toast, and we have Cyclops who's like, Morph, like shut up, Morph. So we also have Gambit who's just kind of sick of Cyclops, and so he immediately throws one of his pieces of food at him, and the food is pink, which immediately means that like Gambit has used his power kind of very like awful here. Like it seems that Gambit is just really going on and using his power way more often than he probably should. And so Jean is kind of putting Gambit in his place because of that, and is to use Jean's power, Jean Grey's power, to kind of bubble that piece of food and have it be shot out this window to where it explodes. And Jean is like, Gambit, you really should not have used your power like that. And then also we come to find that Jean is having a bun in the oven. And by these 3 episodes, we come to find that this kid, of course, is a boy. And I'm like, oh, well, I know what that means. Because, of course, we have both Cyclops and Jean that eventually has, I think, a number of kids. Where at some point we do have I think a girl named Hope. And it's kind of funny where I think there was like a little bit of an Easter egg in the 3rd episode about something about Hope. But so, anyways, moving on. So, we have Jean and we have Cyclops, and it seems that kind of Jean is needing to kind of be aware about what is kind of going on with the last mission that they had been a part of, and kind of also Cyclops giving Gambit shade about him not being really a part of it. But so Cyclops eventually is to realize that this new kid that they're to really have is to possibly be the key to them figuring out how this militia had gotten these Sentinel weapons. Which really in turn forces both Storm and Cyclops to make their way to Sunspot to have really Sunspot not say a lick of anything about what was to have happened with these militia people getting these Sentinel weapons, because he has absolutely no clue. Because really, Sunspot is to just kind of wake up and see a blue beast character, and is to see Jubilee, and Jubilee is like, well, hey, like, I knew what it was like being the new guy here, and really, like, you and me are going to be on kind of even footing. And so we have Cyclops and Storm coming in and asking DaCosta questions, and DaCosta's like, well, hey, how much am I going to have to pay you to, like, get out of here? And Cyclops is like, well, like, it's not about that. It's like, if anything, we're going to have to keep you here and keep you contained here because for safety reasons, because we think that your life may be in jeopardy. And so DaCosta is just like, well, that sucks. It's like, well, what am I going to have to do in the meantime? And so Jubilee's like, I have something for you. So Jubilee wants to go on and figure out what this character's power set is. And so she's running him through the danger room. And I'm like, dude, what if he has no powers whatsoever and they just captured him falsely and he has no powers whatsoever? Or maybe his powers are just so stupid that, like, maybe his power is he can grow an extra finger or some goofy, stupid power that for whatever reason people called him a freak for or hated and feared him. But so Jubilee is having Sunspot go through this danger room and he is going up against Magneto. And Magneto is going and saying all of this stuff that Magneto is traditionally used to saying about how like mutants are his brethren or family or kind or whatever, and that no one should kind of turn his back on him and whatever, all that rigmarole. So Sunspot is going through this simulation. It's like, well, hey, this is cool. This is a fun video game, but like, I don't really care about any of this. And so Sunspot starts to walk away from Magneto, and Magneto's like, oh, like you're gonna turn your back on me. So Magneto sends this this metal thing and tries to strike Sunspot, but Sunspot ends up getting out of the way, and Sunspot is really just going on to avoid some of Magneto's attacks. So the more and more that both Jubilee and Sunspot are just kind of talking, the more that Sunspot is like, dude, I'm not playing this game. And so then we end up getting Wolverine jump in, and he is to put his claws almost seemingly to hurt Sunspot, but it's really just to scare him. And Wolverine is to play around with Sunspot, but Sunspot is to just be like, oh, well, Wolverine is just another simulation. And so Wolverine's like, oh, okay, well, simulation over, and I'm going to show you my claws even more. Just like, hey, be afraid of me. And that ends up having Sunspot like run away with his tail between his legs because he's afraid, because he's scared. So, if I also didn't mention, DaCosta, when he was with both Carl, the eventual executioner, and the mullet guy, he had a inhibitor collar that they end up explaining, of course, has mutants not be able to use their powers. And the only time that collar's really heavily focused on is really Days of Future Past. But at some point, we also get Magneto who's wearing the collar, but still, like, it's not really a huge thing about this show besides kind of like the Days of Future Past stuff. Whenever they get to that, like, that's always to be the most time when a collar is to be used. But so we have Scott Summers and Jean Grey talking to Dr. Cooper, who is to be a old friend of Magneto, and we have Scott and Jean asking Cooper, it's like, well, hey, like, how is it that this militia is getting these weapons because we can't get any answers from this DaCosta kid, so we have to come to you and think that maybe like Trask is missing, and that maybe there is to be another Sentinel facility out there, and they kind of have to do kind of these flashbacks to these old images of the Trask Sentinel facility, and come to find that it is all like destroyed now, and that really like the X-Men should come up with some ways of figuring out if there is another facility present somewhere, but we really just find out that Trask is kind of resurging his old Sentinel facility to piece together these older Sentinels to try and go up against the X-Men, and we'll find that out by the end of this first episode when we go to the Sahara Desert. Or really, I almost thought that this was like, is this Genosha finally? Or not Genosha. The one location that was in the Deadpool video game that had all the Sentinels in it. But so after going on and having both Scott and Jean talk to Cooper and not really getting much headway out of that, it's like, well, like there's only one guy that we could probably go to that would probably have the information about who is to really know where to go to get to Trask, and that would of course be Gyrich. But let's hold that a little bit here, because eventually they come to that real conclusion after a little bit more dialogue here. So we have Scott and we have Jean, who are to look at Charles Xavier's death certificate, and really that had gone to hit Cyclops really hard, but then also like kind of force Cyclops into like, well, I guess I have to do all of these things now that I didn't think I would ever have to really legitimately do, because Xavier was always there. And also, there was always a time where I feel that Xavier wasn't going to fully make Cyclops like the Charles Xavier like character. And even in this show, we kind of realized that Cyclops is not going to be the new Charles Xavier anyways, because we'll have Magneto. So anyways, we have really both Jean and Cyclops, after seeing the death certificate of Charles Xavier and have that finally hit them that he's really gone. Jean is like, well, maybe we should kind of look beyond like being X-Men. And Cyclops was like, well, wait a minute, what? Like, do you mean that we should like quit the team? And Jean is like, well, I don't know, like we should really just kind of think of like what's going to be best for our child that's coming on the way. And so, and plus also Jean brings up that story of the X-Men kind of sneaking out to the lake, and Xavier and Cyclops kind of having this argument, and Charles is to have docked Cyclops 5 demerits. And in the third episode, we kind of bring that back about demerit things in a very kind of creepy-ish like way, with a kind of scary looking Xavier. But so we have both Scott and Jean, who is to hear some fireworks going off from Jubilee, and they run off to the basketball court to figure out what's going on there. And so Jubilee is very upset with Wolverine because Wolverine had gone on to scare off Sunspot. And so both Wolverine and Jubilee are fighting, and so Scott comes in and is to tell him like, hey, like, if anything, you're bickering, like, you guys are just kind of like wasting your time on and wasting your energy on something where really the real solution of your problem should really just be that you go out and try to find Sunspot and also bring along the characters that haven't really been doing much of anything, like Rogue and Gambit and Morph, and have us kind of understand where their characters are possibly going with this show beyond them possibly just being comic relief. And so we then, of course, have where Cyclops is to tell you where he's going to meet up in an interrogation room with Gyrick. So the next thing we see is to be this nightclub. And so we of course have Wolverine, who is a really good tracker. Of course, if you know the Wolverine history. But so werewolf, yeah, like maybe at some point we've had a number of Marvel characters become vampires and werewolves and all kinds of things. But so let's move on here. So Wolverine is whiffing out the kid and he knows exactly where he is. And so we have Rogue and Gambit who are separating off to have Rogue mention that if she's to go on and actually touch somebody, they could get a pretty good hangover. And Gambit is like, well, you can touch me all you like because I'd love to get a dance with you. Cher or whatever the heck that he always has is the goofy kind of nicknames for Rogue. But so we also have Wolverine and Morph who are having this conversation. And we also have to realize that Wolverine has a good uh, ability to hear things. So we're kind of wondering if Wolverine is to know what all is always ever going on in the X Mansion because he can hear so well compared to everyone else. And so Wolverine already knows that Jean is leaving uh, the X-Men and possibly also Cyclops is too, because Jean is. But so we have Wolverine and he's just kind of in a grumpier mood than probably normal. And so Morph is kind of joking around and becoming Jean and is to talk to Wolverine and just be like, oh, well, yeah, I get that you're so upset that I'm pregnant with Cyclops's uh Cyclops' son, and like we're just plain old boring people. And Wolverine eventually interrupts Morph to just tell him it's like, well, like, yeah, I am upset that eventually, like, Jean and Cyclops are going to be leaving the X-Men. And Morph is like, oh no, they're not going to do that. And Wolverine's like, yeah, they are. They've already talked about it. And so Morph is like, oh, well, yeah, I can guess that could be a reason why you are upset. And so, like, that whole conversation ends up getting dropped. So, we see DaCosta, and he is Raven. He's glow sticking on the dance floor, and Jubilee, of course, ends up joining him. And Jubilee is to be like, okay, kid, like, let's go back to the mansion. And DaCosta's like, no, like, I'll go back with you as long as you dance with me on the dance floor. And Jubilee's like, oh, okay. So Jubilee like starts to like fire off some of her fireworks as they're to both kind of talk together as Jubilee is trying as much as possible to somehow or another get to know Sunspot. And so Logan eventually comes in and interrupts this whole dance number, just like, okay, kid, like it's time for you to come back. And so eventually DaCosta agrees to all that. So we have Cyclops, Bishop, and Storm make their way to this interrogation room. Again, the only person that really matters is honestly just Cyclops here, and eventually Jean, because we'll get to that. So, Cyclops and Garrick, I want to say Gyrick or Garrick, I'm not quite sure which is the exact pronouncing. I think it's Gyrick. So, Cyclops and Gyrick are talking, and we eventually, like, the only real important thing is that if Garrick is not going to give up this information about Trask, that Jean is going to forcibly do it through Cerebro and amplify her power. And so Jean starts going through Garrick's brain about the whole history of him and Trask being together. And eventually, this all of a sudden leads to this kind of Terminator like scene. Like Terminator Judgment Day, if you were to see Sarah Connor and she's at that playground, same kind of thing going on here, where we all of a sudden have Jean, who has her Nathan Cable baby in her arm, and she's eventually seeing where Trask's journey is possibly going to head, with there being uh, the master mold and the Sentinels that are going to go on and kind of just destroy the world here. So, and also that there's going to just be a big, huge, massive explosion, which leads to Jean throwing off the Cerebral helmet and just needing a breather. As Cyclops is to ask Jean, it's like, hey, are you okay? And really, I can understand eventually within these episodes how, like, Jean eventually gets just pregnant because of all the stress that she is put on herself, but then also just uh, the stress of possibly the world ending, maybe. So after it is to be this interrogation, they realized that they had kind of spanned through this guy's mind to figure out that the location of Trask is to possibly be in the Sahara Desert. So all the X-Men, with the exclusion of possibly Jean and certain other characters, are to make their way into the X-Jet. And so really, I always wanted to call the X-Jet the X-Wing, or some other word uh, that eventually I think ends up getting used in the Avengers things. But anyways, it's the X-Jet. So we go on to have our characters flying in the X-Jet, and we have them kind of bickering back and forth. We have, of course, Wolverine calling Cyclops dad, and we have, of course, Wolverine, who's saying that Trask is going to go on a diet because he's going to really chop him up. And so all this is to all be thwarted, this whole family flying fun experience, by a Sentinel that is to rip into the X-Jet. And we have all the X-Men that are all in the air, and we would of course have Cyclops is calling out to everybody. It's like, hey, like, you guys have to all find a way down on the ground because I'm going to be able to easily find one. So we would of course have Rogue, who I think is to be the big one that is to take out the Sentinel and kind of crush through it. But then we also have characters that like can fly, that are like Storm, and eventually Morph ends up morphing into Angel, who of course has wings, and so he ends up kind of helping out certain characters, and like everybody ends up getting down to the surface safe, and then Cyclops ends up using his blast like very heavily to where he can land safe onto the ground. And so then is here we get the big massive shot where Cyclops is like, "To me, my X-Men." So the shot that's in all of the trailers, the big shot that I think everybody freaking uses for this show, like to me, my X-Men seems to be like the slogan of this entire show. To me, and then also is the title of the very first episode. To me, my X-Men. So really at some certain point, if anybody wants to go on and have me do the voice for Cyclops, I'll be happy to do so. But I don't think I'll do it that well, especially when it gets beyond to me, my X-Men, because I'll have to go on and I'll have to talk like this, and it probably won't sound that great. Because yeah, once we get past that, um, but so anyways, we transition to, of course, our X-Men making our way to the broken down Sentinel facility, and that immediately has them like face up against Trask, who is to start having his fallen Sentinels be brought back to life. And I'm really loving how our X-Men characters are to be, I think, really better handled in this show as far as like what they're going to do, because we had Cyclops who goes on and he uses his blast to kind of move around all over the place, and in this battle we have Beast who ends up kind of using certain wires and stuff together to eventually like man one of these Sentinels. I'm like, all right, like this is really clever. And again, like probably all of this stuff might have been from past X-Men whatever things, but like really when looking at this, I'm like, this is a pretty smart maneuver. But it gets foiled by like Wolverine like being thrown into Beast, and we have at, of course, a point where like all of the X-Men are doing well, but then also we really need some reinforcements. We really need the big guns. And of course, the big guns is the forecast, which is coming in by Storm, who is at first like weirdly, she is like lightning bolting a bunch of sand and like turning it into like ice, it seems, with her probably like having using her winter powers in the desert. But then also Storm is coming in really just taking out all of these Sentinels. But then that's not good enough, because we then have the Master Mold Sentinel who's in this throne chair, and he ends up getting up. And so here's where we almost get like the fastball maneuver if you were to ever played any of the X-Men video games, where we would have Colossus who like throws Wolverine, and that of course is to be the fastball maneuver. We have this weird combination going between both Gambit and Wolverine, uh, where Wolverine is running and Gambit is like seemingly behind him, and Gambit ends up supercharging Wolverine to have like pink claws, and we kind of seen this on the trailer too. And so Wolverine ends up calling out to Morph for him to morph into Blob, so we can have Wolverine who jumps onto Blob and him like kind of destroy the head of the Master Mold, and that quickly takes out that character. I'm like, okay, what was the whole point of bringing up that other Master Mold Sentinel for him to just quickly be taken out, but then also having the threat of this Master Mold character being such a huge threat. Didn't quite get what that was, but really also thinking about it, like somewhere later on, there's going to be a bigger Gambit story that has to deal with Sentinels. So legit, like that's kind of where we're heading in this story, is still bringing up a lot more Sentinels later on. So eventually, after all the Sentinels are to be taken off, that is when Dr. Cooper and her kind of people are to come in and arrest Trask, and both Cyclops and Cooper are to talk about how Xavier would eventually be a lot more proud of what Cyclops has now become, and really that's all good and great and all, and we are to transition to have both Jubilee and Sunspot talk to one another. And let me pause here for a second. So Jubilee and Sunspot are talking, and that of course is when we finally reveal that Sunspot is to have the powers that he is to have, and that Sunspot gives Jubilee his card, and it's like, well, hey, like, if you ever want to use my jet, like, just let me know, because I have my own jet. So, we then, like, in the later episodes, we come to find that, like, Sunspot's mother really hates Sunspot and calls him, like, a freak and a monster and whatever, because he has powers. And I kind of think that that's really kind of just fascinating. The more and more we're kind of peeling back the layers of who Sunspot really is, because he's really, to me, just a mystery guy. And hopefully at some point we get to know a lot more about this character. We get a real backstory of this character. But so we turn around and we're having all the X-Men play basketball with no powers. If you were to go on and watch the X-Men movies at some point, we get to see certain times where we have basketball sessions where characters are always to complain to others about how they're using their powers and they shouldn't. That seems to always be a staple for X-Men things. But so we of course have Gambit kind of joke around about him using his other kind of power, which of course is to, I guess, be really just sex appeal when he's taking his shirt off. So we have Storm turn to Cyclops, and it's like, okay, well, since it seems that you are the real leader of the X-Men, like, how about you go on and you choose a team? And Cyclops is to just be like, well, like, with all that's kind of been happening lately, I think it's time for me and Jean to make an announcement. And then all of a sudden, by that time, we come to like stop and have B say, it's like, well, hey, like, we have an intruder in the X Mansion, and come to find out that intruder is none other than Magneto. But so also, there's one thing that I want to mention as well. When Beast, of course, was talking to DaCosta and was also with Jubilee. We come to find out that Beast is also working on Bishop's like time band, his time gadget. And so I'm like, okay, like that is really interesting to kind of play around with. And in the by the third episode, we come to find that time band thing actually comes to be very important. But it seems to be just kind of thing that they consistently talk about, but then again, like doesn't really come important until the third episode. But I kind of forgot about that, and plus this episode is kind of technically wrapping up. But so we have the X-Men coming in, but like, okay, like Magneto, what does he want? What is he here for? And so Cyclops is looking at Magneto and just being like, "Well, hey, like you don't belong here. Like, like what's what's the reasoning and so on." And so Magneto is like, "Well, hey, like you're kind of telling me I don't belong here, but if anything, like from Charles Xavier's will, like that is to really be the differ, and I actually own this place, and you are my X-Men." And so I'm like, oh my god, Charles Xavier put in his will that Magneto gets everything. So in the very second episode, we do get to find out like what Magneto's real intentions are beyond him just owning the X Mansion, that he's kind of turned over a new leaf for the most point. Like he still like is to be a person that is to try and seek justice for the crimes of his kind, the mutants, but also like he's trying to change who he was from his past self. So in episode 2, we start the episode off in Coney Island, where a merry-go-round is to kind of lose uh, its positioning and start to fall off. And so Magneto comes in and he recorrects the merry-go-round, saving this firefighter who has this kid with this Walkman that had broke. And so all of a sudden people are like, oh my god, like Magneto is saving people, and the news is covering it. And they're also saying it's like, well, hey, Magneto's back in town, like things have gotten from bad to worse, and like if anything, like Magneto should be like enemy number one. So like Cyclops and Jean are looking on the news and they're like, oh my god, like Cyclops, like Magneto is helping people, and Dr. Cooper is looking on and she's seeing that Magneto is helping people. It's like, well, yeah, but like that's not going to save you from me wanting to arrest you. And also, like the executioner Carl, he's looking on and he's like, like I'm gonna get that guy and I'm gonna make it so that like he loses all his powers from this one weird uh, gun bullet concoction that I'm gonna have. So we now go to the underground or the underworld, wherever this legitimately is. And we come to find that the Morlocks, Callisto, Leech, and other Morlocks, are to be tied up from this militia people, and they are to have these Sentinel blasters. And we have Callisto and Leech that are begging for their lives. They're like, well, hey, like, you can't go on and do this. Like, we haven't done anything to you. And so we again have Magneto that comes in from the smoke and the shadows to go on to save these Morlocks, and is to kind of tell Leech, it's like, well, hey man, like we're in a good state right now. It's like I'm gonna help you guys out. So we have all the X-Men get together in this room. I think it's the War Room, and they're all talking about Xavier's decision to give Magneto this whole place. It's like, do you think that this is right? It's like, do you really think that Magneto is going to change over New Leaf? Like, what was Xavier thinking when he was doing this? So after that moment, we have Magneto coming in and mentioning that it's like, well, hey, like all the people that I had gone on to save who are mutants, I had taken them to Genosha, which, of course, Genosha, if people do not know, because I don't know if Genosha has ever really been covered in any of the animated stuff. Genosha is, of course, be an oasis for all mutants to live and be and exist. And Magneto is to somehow figure out a way to have gone on and owned Genosha. So really, Genosha is a thing that has mostly been heavily covered in the comic books, mainly around the time where it was to be Avengers versus X-Men, and everything kind of past that. We kind of keep going back to Genosha with the comic books. They continue to reference this thing. It's a big thing for X-Men to always reference Genosha some way or another. But so Magneto is to try to convince this group that he is not here as a threat to them, but Cyclops wants to go even further to have Jean read his mind and see if he's really telling the truth. And Jean is like, no, like I'm not going to use my powers against Magneto, even if he does have his helmet off. And Cyclops is like, why aren't you? And like you used it on Gyrich just an episode ago. And Jean is like, well, that was different because like he's an evil man, and also just like it's a whole different circumstance. Like we needed that information, and there was no way he was going to give us that information freely. So Cyclops is just like, well, like with thinking of how much like Magneto is such a threat to us, like maybe we should go on and read his mind like all the time. Just make sure that he is just not going to turn on us at any second of any day. But so after that is all kind of bogged down. We have Jean who turns to her room and is to reflect on this old costume of hers that I'm sure eventually she's going to put on again and reflect on this costume being some space adventure by the time roughly that she was to, I think, be the Phoenix at some point. Because she is talking about this space adventure that they had gone on to have. And all of a sudden, Storm comes in and is to eventually have both Jean and Storm talk about Jean's baby and kind of being back and forthing of whether or not that Jean's baby should be human or not. So the baby probably wouldn't have to be in as much jeopardy if it was human. It wouldn't have to go through all of the hate and fearing and prejudice that comes with that. But then also Storm is like, well, hey, like if it is a mutant, then it also gets to be a part of this whole experience, being an X-Men and being in the X-Mention and being a part of this family because we're all really just a family and we're all the same because we're all mutants. And so Rogue and Magneto end up talking to one another, and I'm like, okay, we're really kind of pushing the fact that it seems that more and more there's going to be possibility that Magneto and Rogue are going to be possible lovers. And in all honesty, like, I can understand that because in the later and later kind of X-Men stories, we would even have at certain points Rogue being a villain to the X-Men. And in all honesty, I always thought that that would be the way that Rogue would go, of her just always being a villain. I don't know why. Even when we have the kind of the cowgirl approach to Rogue here, like, still, I always thought that Rogue would be better suited as a villain than as a hero because of her power set and how eventually she like touches people and drains them, killing them at some certain points also mistakenly, but still. So Magneto and Rogue are talking here, and so Magneto is bringing up kind of like the First Class movie kind of things where Magneto was to bring up the fact that him and Charles used to be the best of friends, and how Magneto was consistently always letting Charles kind of within his mind, and eventually it got to the point where Magneto wanted to separate himself from Charles by putting on the Magneto helmet, and also Rogue is kind of bringing up her past and her upbringing, and nothing that I could probably go on and probably remember here. So we come to have Dr. Cooper and her people via helicopters making their way to the X Mansion to need to talk to Magneto to arrest him. And so Dr. Cooper's people are to be holding up these weapons against the mutants. And the X-Men are just like, well, what the heck? Like, man, like I thought we were friends. Like I thought we had like a treaty kind of going on here, Cooper. And Cooper was like, well, like I don't have a like I don't have a peace treaty, or I don't have a truce against Magneto. So with all the crimes that he's ever committed. So Cooper is to have her chess move already together where she's like, well, hey, our weapons that we have on our men, yeah, like you won't be able to control them with your power, Magneto. And Magneto is just like, ha 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 ha, I can just control the helicopters that you flew in on, and if I want to, kill you that way. But so Magneto is like, but I'm not gonna do that. You know what? I'm just gonna turn myself in, cuff me, and everybody's at this point looking at Magneto and going like, oh, like Magneto really has changed. So everybody is looking at Magneto in a different way, and even Rogue is looking at him in a different way, if you know what I mean. And so we come to find that Magneto is going to be put to a trial and have these judges judging him. So mm, the TV is going on to cover the trial as both Jean and Wolverine are kind of looking on. And we have Jean going and asking Wolverine, it's like, well, hey, like, where is Cyclops? And Wolverine is going to say, it's like, well, hey, like Cyclops is kind of looking on at this trial, kind of making sure that like there's nothing that's going to happen with Magneto because like he's public enemy number one. And so Jean is like, well, hey, I wasn't made aware that Cyclops was kind of going out or or was to do anything. And Wolverine is like, well, yeah, it seems like people not telling anybody anything is kind of going around here. So also having Wolverine kind of throw back to Jean about them possibly quitting being X-Men, but how people are kind of really often keeping secrets. So we have Carl finally becoming the executioner here, and he's to kind of put this kind of mask upon himself and is to have this gun-like weapon that he's going to use to possibly take down Magneto here. So Magneto is to be on this trial, and he is to go on and talk about his past, how he is to talk about this hunting situation that at some point he would go on to reveal his powers to people, and he had been hated and feared and all of that nonsense. And he is to have mentioned that he is to have only always tried to avenge the crimes against his mutant kind. And so the further and further that this trial is to be put together, and the judges are to possibly kind of hear Magneto out, the more that we have to realize that everybody is to be in jeopardy in this trial or to be possibly a target. And when it seems that there is to be a number of people that all want to come in and bum rush these proceedings, we have Cyclops, who's to try to use his X-Men team to prevent any kind of militia or any people coming in to try and uh, hurt anybody. But so while this whole thing is going on, we have Jean, who eventually is to try and rush to Wolverine because her baby is coming. Her water had broke, and so Logan is just like, oh my god, like we need to get to a hospital. And Jean is to kind of toss the keys into Logan's hand. So we have the executioner that is to make his way against the X-Men. And we get this really cool moment where all these other X-Men start just showing up, or all these other kind of mutants are to start showing up. Like Deathstrike shows up, Colossus shows up, and also Psylocke is to show up and is to kind of help out the mutants in this situation. And I thought that was really cool. Whether or not that is to all have just been, one of them is to have been Morph, I don't know, but legit, like, it was just kind of cool to see those three characters just kind of be a part of this whole situation. But so we have the executioner that eventually is to fight with Cyclops, and Cyclops loses his visor, and the executioner is to talk about how Cyclops, as well as just his kind in general, are to all just be whiners, and they just whine about where they are in the world. And that's the thing that he just kind of hates about them the most, if not just them being mutants. So Jean is to use her ability to try and speak with Cyclops to just be like, hey, like the baby's coming. And so Cyclops goes on to now tell Storm, it's like, well, hey, like you kind of need to like take my place here, and I need to go off with Rogue to go to the hospital because Jean's in labor. So Cyclops, before really leaving, he kind of takes control of the situation, but not the executioner, because Magneto kind of takes on that responsibility. So Storm is to be talking to these judges that are to be possibly in the crosshairs of all this going on. And Storm forces the judges to work together with the mutants. As even possible, we could realize that maybe some of the judges or realize that, like, oh my god, I'm going to be working with mutants? Like, no, like, I don't think I trust them. It's like, well, hey, you're going to have to because we all got to, like, be in this together. We're all seeing that a person is going to be threatening us. So Wolverine is to be at the doctor's office, and he's grabbing this doctor that does not want to go on and operate on Jean because she's a mutant. And it's like, well, hey, like, who knows, like, in a pregnancy, like, Jean's powers can get way out of control, or also, like, with this baby, like, we don't know what the baby's powers is, so the baby could just explode and we could all die, and who knows. So there's too many variables to consider. So Cyclops eventually makes his way to the hospital with Rogue, and so Cyclops looks at Rogue and it's like, well, hey, like you have the ability to just kind of take this guy's knowledge of medical doctrine, and you can go on and you can just touch him and be able to deliver this baby regardless for however long that we need you to. So, like, why don't you just touch him and you can deliver the baby, is how they kind of figure this out. So, back with Magneto and Storm. So, Magneto and Storm are together using their powers. They're synchronizing their powers, and it's like really a lot of cool effects going on here. And so Executioner comes on in, and he ends up trying to shoot Magneto, but Storm ends up taking the bullet for Magneto, and Storm ends up completely losing her powers. But then they have to also have Beast reiterate that it's like, well, yeah, like she's lost her powers permanently later on. So Magneto goes on to look at the judges and is just so upset at this point that he is to take the executioner and use his power to kind of hold executioner, but then also is to have the judges also be kind of hoisted up as well, because Magneto is just ticked off by the fact that Storm has gone out of his way, or out of her way to always help out mutants, but also mankind as a whole. And look what she's to go on and get rewarded after that fact. And so Magneto is to go on and say to these people that it's like, you know what, I can just crush you with the weight of my boot, but like I'm really remembering Charles and remembering that Charles never wanted me to kill, and that I'm also trying to be better. I'm trying to uh, kind of not be who I once was and trying to look for possibly a better way. And so the next thing that we end up having to see here is Jean is now holding her child that she had given birth to, who, of course, ends up being called Nathan Charles Summers, which a lot of us would probably know as Cable. And we, within these 3 episodes, get to find out like how Cable becomes a thing with his virus that he ends up getting in the 3rd episode. But so, Dr. Cooper is to be going on the news and is to go on and accept a Genosha as one of the UN locations for Magneto to go on and kind of be the leader of that kind of locale, or that representative of that locale, and have at any point in time that like Genosha can have an equal like say of kind of what's going on in the world. And so we have both Magneto and Cyclops kind of talking together here, and it seems more and more that with the way Magneto is really going on to handle things, Cyclops is starting to become much more accepting of Magneto kind of taking over kind of Charles's place, because Cyclops is also just kind of like, well, hey, I'm a dad now, and I really need to go on and kind of much more focus on that than like really being so heavily the leader of the X-Men and needing to have to like fill Charles's big shoes that he has left. So here's where we go on and we have Beast, who again is working on Bishop's time band, but then is to also need to explain to Storm how permanent her power loss is, forcing then to have Storm decide that she does not want to ever really personally say goodbye to the X-Men group, but instead is to write a letter out and is to leave it for Jean, and Jean is to make her way to Storm's room to then take the letter and read it out to the rest of the X-Men group. So we find that Magneto is with Rogue again, and Rogue ends up taking off her glove, and Magneto touches on to Rogue, and we're thinking like, all right, like they're really showing that there's going to be something between the two of them. But then also, we're possibly seeing that Rogue may just be touching on to Magneto, just like, hey man, I really want to get this guy's power to possibly even use against him if really need be. Maybe that could be just Rogue's strategy all along, that she's kind of being a double agent or a secret agent to just kind of continue to be so close to Magneto and earn his trust, so that if he is to eventually turn on the X-Men, Rogue can just be like, aha, well, guess what? Like, I'm going to touch you and use your powers against you. Or just suck the life out of him and kill him if that ever has to be forcibly the case. So, Morph is looking out at Logan, who is to be at this tree, all just sad and like usual. And Morph is to just turn to Wolverine of like, hey, I got some beers, and I can just turn into Sabretooth, and we can kind of play around, whatever that really means. But so that was kind of just a fun, goofy moment where like Morph is just trying to get like Logan to just kind of cheer freaking the F up, dude. Cheer that make that frown come upside down for a little bit. Cause like, hey man, like Morph just needs something really to do. But so Storm goes on this bus, and we again have like Jean read the letter to all the X-Men about how she's leaving, how that just kind of sucks. And so Morph like doesn't really believe that Storm is really gone. It's like, well, hey, like Storm is such a staple in this group that we like she can't just leave. She can't just leave. Like she's gonna have some secret amulet or find some goofy weird thing of an alternate world somewhere and just become Storm again, right? That's how every single one of these scenarios end up playing out. But so we all of a sudden have a knock at the door. I'm like, okay, like Magneto is already here. Like, who else is going to show up? And we come to find out that Jean shows up. I'm like, what the heck? What's going on? We have two Jeans. We have double the Jeans. And I'm thinking, like, is there going to be a like Days of Future Past scenario happening here, where we come to find that this is like a Jean from the future, and she's giving these guys some information about her future, but we come to find out no, like this is to be like actually the legitimate Jean that just showed up one day at the doorstep. So Beast goes on to like diagnose that like this Jean is to seemingly be the right age Jean, and that the Jean that they actually do have, like there's something actually wrong about her. So Jean goes on to read the mind of this other Jean to eventually go through all of these memories, and it seems that everything seems to be there up until a certain point, and that at some point this Jean is talking about hope. But so we come to the conclusion that the Jean that had delivered Nathan is obviously a clone. That, of course, when Mr. Sinister had both Cyclops and Jean, that Sinister had gone on to clone Jean. And I'm like, well, yeah, like, we would have had to have assessed that, like, Sinister had gone on to really just kind of do a number of things to a number of X-Men characters, especially when both like Magneto and Charles were, of course, also to be close to the Sinister's lair, and with that episode where they were tying in Sinister. So, or when they were trying to get to the Sinister, and they were kind of battling Triceratopses and all kinds of stuff. So, moving on. Jean runs off holding her baby, and Cyclops kind of goes in on Jean, and it's like, hey, like, since you're kind of the clone Jean, like, maybe you should give me back Nathan, so I can take care of him now, because you're not the real Jean. And they're kind of arguing back and forth, but the real argument is the fact that Cyclops wants this baby, And the fact that Cyclops is asking for it really is to upset Jean very greatly, because it's like, no, like, I'm the real Jean. Like, I have all these memories. Like, I had given birth to your child, and you're telling me I'm not real. Like, this, like, has really just gone on to upset Jean to the point of, like, no, I'm going to hold on to this child, and you're just going to walk away. So we all of a sudden have this voice that is going over the baby monitor, and I'm like, okay, who the heck is this voice? Come to find out, it's Mr. Sinister. I'm like, all right, sweet, we're getting some Sinister. This is pretty great. Of course, the thing that I only really remember Sinister from really being in is the Deadpool video game. But then also I remember him being on that island, uh, nabbing up Cyclops and Jean. But anyways, Beast goes on to again talk with Bishop about his whole time ban situation, and Cyclops is in there also asking about, like, well, hey, like how are we gonna, like, definitely confirm that Jean is a clone or not? And eventually Beast kind of quickly figures out that it's like, well, hey, the only way that we can kind of confirm whether Jean is to be a clone or not is to really be from Nathan and get his DNA. And really also, if we're to really think that Jean is a clone, that there can only be one person who can go on and to have done that, and of course that has to be Mr. Sinister. And so Jean goes on and continues to talk to this baby monitor, and we come to find that the baby monitor is to state that it wants Nathan. That the only reason why this Jean clone was ever born was to just give birth to this child. So, Jean, we come to find, is to not really be Jean altogether, but is to be this alternate person who is to actually be Madeline Pryor. Immediately when this person changed into this costume in this black leather, because Sinister is telling Jean, it's like, well, hey, like, I can completely control you, as well as also get what I want from you, which is to be Nathan, by just forcing you into becoming Madeline Pryor, which they don't actually say that she's Madeline Pryor until the very end of the episode, but still. So Jean turns into black leather and is to be Madeline Pryor with the red kind of jewel and the red ruby piece upon her head. So we then have this show really pick up if it hadn't already. So we have Logan, we have Gambit, and we have Morph, who are all in the danger room, and Gambit's talking about how, like, he honestly had no control over, like, his powers because the cards were just getting really wild, and Morph, of course, ends up being upset with Gambit for how he was treated. So Morph ends up looking at the Danger Room schedule and seeing, like, oh, well, every single time after the scheduled time that we have, like, Magneto and Rogue are kind of working together. What does that mean, Gambit? And Gambit is like, well, wait, no, 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 no. Like, both Rogue and Gambit, or Rogue and Magneto, are kind of out patrolling. So, I don't know what you're talking about. And Gambit is like, well, maybe I should kind of look more into this. And so Logan looks at Morph. It's like, man, you just really like gave him like a stomach ache. So Logan decides to separate from Morph by going to see how the other Jean, who is now not Madeline Pryor, but the other Jean, like how she's doing. And Morph is like, okay, back to just me and me alone. So both Sunspot and Jubilee are both watching a movie together, but then all of a sudden they notice on the TV that the characters in the movie are looking right at them, and Sunspot is like, "Do you notice that?" It's like, "Yeah, that's kind of little weird." And so Gambit makes his way back to Rogue's room to find both Rogue and Magneto are kind of in a hugging situation together, and they're in the clutches and the throes of possible passion. And Gambit's like, "No, how could this be?" And we think that this is Rogue and Magneto, but then we find it that their like skin is starting to like fall off of one another, and Gambit is to like come from out of that room and like, oh my god, like that is like one of my worst ever nightmares. And so Sunspot and Jubilee are continuing to watch this movie, and all of a sudden this monster comes from out of this tube TV, and Jubilee uses her fireworks to try and combat it. And so this monster ends up turning to Sunspot's mother, and is to start to say how she hates and calls him a monster and hates him and fears him and all that jazz. So Cyclops and Bishop are in a separate room, and we all of a sudden come to find out that the room, all of a sudden, one turns to a kind of creepy looking Xavier, and is having Cyclops get all these demerits. And at one point, we have the head of Bishop's sister talking to Bishop about how like disappointed she is of him. And we have the two of them, both Xavier and Cyclops, get out of that situation to and find Gambit and the rest of the group as like, hey man, like something's really going off here. Like we all have to regroup together and figure out what the heck is all going on. So as well as also like Cyclops and the other X-Men seeing what's going on with Jubilee and Sunspot. So by the time that Morph and Wolverine get with the rest of the X-Men team, Morph is probably realizing that they're in hell, but really they're just up against Madeline Pryor. So as the ground is to shake and is to crumble around them, going deeper and deeper into this quasi hell like environment, we then come to find some goblins or demon gargoyle-ish like creatures are going on to attack the X-Men. And regardless of probably the legitimate name of any number of these creatures, I just assume that they're naturally goblins, because that's what kind of Madeline Pryor is being known for, to be known as like the Goblin Queen. So that's what I just go on and say that these creatures probably really are, with not actually 100% realizing if that's exactly what these things actually are. Um, if not kind of just demons or whichever. So these demons are all attacking the the X-Men, and we of course have Bishop who turns to Cyclops like, well, hey man, if you blast me, like I'm gonna use my power and be able to take out all of these goblins. And after Bishop goes on and does that, both Cyclops and Bishop turn to one another and say you're welcome to one another, which I thought was kind of funny. So we have a Sentinel that is to just kind of get more kind of demonic with like these kind of horns, and it looks very weird. And that ends up starting to come in to all of this. But then by that time, we finally have the other Jean that is to just put a stop to all this. And Jean and like Pryor are going to eventually kind of duke it out, but Jean ends up like stopping what Pryor is doing and sending the X-Men back to where they were, which was the mansion. And Madeline Pryor is to present herself to the team as the Goblin Queen, and is to take their son Nathan uh, with her. So their meaning their son, meaning Jean and Cyclops, technically, even though it's actually from her womb. So Morph, because he is to have a really good history with Mr. Sinister, is to go on and explain the past that he is to have had with Sinister and how bad this guy really is. So Jean, it seems, is not wanting to go on and join the X-Men and trying to fight off Madeline, because her powers are kind of very much overwhelming her right now. And I'm like, oh, is she going to eventually become the Phoenix? Or, like, is that a possibility even that you can become that? Because really, she's going to have to tap into the Phoenix Force, and I don't know if that's going to be a real legit possibility here. But then also, I think Jean becoming the Phoenix would be a lot more interesting for her character for this story. And also, when you look at the intro, like Jean is the Phoenix in the intro part of this X-Men show. So if she doesn't become the Phoenix, it's kind of a waste. But anyways, so Magneto is kind of being the leader of the group, but also just kind of stating it's like, well, hey, like the next thing that we should really be doing here is like going after Sinister. So that's what I'm doing. Like, we're gonna take the fight to this guy instead of kind of waiting for the next time that we're probably gonna get these attacks to happen. So Cyclops is just like, okay, like that sounds like the right strategy here. So Sinister goes on to take Nathan and is to put him in this tube to state that he's like, okay, I'm going to take this baby to possibly make other things that I am to go on and I'm going to need to create others to possibly make a Nathan clone at some point. But so Magneto's team arrives at the Sinister Castle, and Morph ends up shifting into becoming a character known as Magic. Magic, if you do not know, is to have been in the New Mutants movie. So, legitimately, if you've never heard of Magic before, you could check out the New Mutants movie and see this character in action. But then also, like, I'm assuming, like, you can go on to Marvel Strike Force and also just see Magic in action as well. Because I played her in that game also. So, uh, Morph becomes Magic, and Pryor ends up just taking control of Morph, and so Morph goes on and attacks the X-Men team, and Morph goes on to fight Bishop, and Magneto goes on to fight Pryor. And Pryor ends up telling Magneto, it's like, hey, like, just because you have your magnetism powers, like, that's not really good enough to fight against me. So, after Pryor's to go on and kind of do well against Magneto, Cyclops goes on to uh to to blast Pryor and is to make her bleed, and Cyclops is like, "Oh, I didn't mean to do that." And we go back to now Wolverine that is talking to Jean and trying to get her to have a better control of her power. And kind of the interaction that's going on between both Wolverine and Jean kind of reminds me very much of the Last Stand movie, where Jean is in that movie talking about how she was to kill Scott, and how Wolverine is saying, it's like, well, hey, like, Charles can help you, Charles can fix it. And Jean is like, I don't want to fix it. And then she, like, pushes him away. Like, kind of very much reminds me of that whole kind of scene there. But so, Wolverine and Jean are kind of having a moment here, and we get to where Jean realizes that Cyclops is in danger, and so she's like, well, you know what? I have to leave because Cyclops could die. And so Jean rushes off to face against Pryor, and we get a moment where Pryor ends up going into Jean, and we have them go on to reflect about the very first time that a young Jean had met with Charles Xavier, and that her best friend had died, and that's what kind of was a kind of a trauma thing that lead her to, I guess, eventually become a possible hero or a mutant or whatever, and having them kind of reflect on a bunch of kind of old memories that Pryor would have gone on and taken a bunch of photos and broken of Jean's past, because she feels that those weren't really her memories and that she was robbed of all those past events. So we also have to reflect on Pryor's memories and how she had given birth to Nathan, and that one thing is to be uh, the main reason why Pryor is to realize, like, what a mistake that she is to, of course, be making, and forces Pryor to come back to the good side of things, and then have both Jean and Pryor work together to face off against Sinister. But by the time, of course, that Jean and Pryor are to face off against Sinister, Sinister is to kind of fade off into the shadows because he realizes that he's kind of outmatched here. So Sinister gives the X-Men one last parting gift, which is to, of course, be in now Nathan, which is to be a uh, which is to be this virus, this techno virus that, of course, Beast is to go on and explain what exactly it is. And so it seems that Sinister is to place this virus upon Nathan and realize that there is no cure for said thing. And Cyclops and Jean realize well, hey, it's not a cure for it now, but maybe there's a cure for it somewhere in the future. And Bishop having the ability to go back to the future now, maybe he's going to come up with a cure for it by that time. And so Jean goes on and uses her mind power to talk to Nathan to help Nathan better understand why they had gone on and done the things that they're doing to kind of leave him with Bishop, Nathan, and have Cyclops be kind of very upset about possibly abandoning his son. And so really Bishop goes on to get this time portal thing so he can go to the future. So after that, since all the dust is kind of settled and Pryor is now a good person, Pryor is going on and talking to Jean, and it's just be well, you know what? I'm just gonna leave, and I'm gonna just take my name of Madeline Pryor, and I'm just gonna leave. I'm gonna just deuce out of here. And so you would have thought that Logan would have ran after Pryor because that's another Jean that he could be with, and everything all would have been great. It would all just perfectly panned out for Wolverine to have the woman that he's always ever wanted. But instead, he doesn't. I just feel that he probably eventually is going to end up with Morph because he's not even really even considering being with Jean. Even though it's a clone, it's still Jean anyways. So we're possibly thinking also that Pryor is probably going to end up going back with Storm, and really we transition to now Storm, who's at a bar somewhere and is all of a sudden talking to a guy named Forge, who's well, hey, I can help you out in your predicament of you losing your powers. And kind of that's how this third episode ends. So with that said, I'm thinking I'm going to try as quickly as possible to just kind of get out of here. Whew. Yeah, these 3 episodes were really fun, and it's really it's kind of also been a thing I've been missing to really get into these kind of animated things, and really find something that's also really good uh, as far as comic book animated stuff, because it's been a while, it's been some time, and also really these anime things have kind of really heavily dipped in quality. So at some point, I would really love to find an animated or just animated thing in general that's just really good, and also is to just also be surprisingly popular. And hopefully, I'll go on and at some point find that. But until then, we're just going to keep kind of going into all this content. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.